Tonight we're going to talk about the SPL in PHP. It's the Standard PHP Library. Basically what it is it's a bunch of object-oriented stuff that they've bolted onto PHP, and it solves a bunch of problems that you may have already had to solve yourself, but they're just kind of built into the language. It's been here since PHP 5.0, but every kind of point release, they usually add one or two little additional things to it. So the list you see in the documentation may or may not match what you actually have in the PHP you're working with. So you just need to be cognizant of, basically if you're in 5.3, you're going to have pretty much all of this. If you're in 5.2, you're not going to have some of it. So you just need to be aware of that. But you've got a couple different kind of classes of things here. I just picked out a handful to talk about because there's like 75 of these in here, and a lot of them are the same kind of similar concepts. One of the ones we're not going to talk about because I think it's extremely boring is the data structures ones. But if you go back to your computer science textbooks, all those things that you learned about in first year computer science, they're all listed right there. Your stacks, queues, heaps, priority queues. So if you for some reason found in your daily work that you actually needed a doubly linked list, there's an implementation built into PHP, and this is an object that you can just instantiate and start using. You don't have to write any code, they just threw it in for you. All of these have pretty decent documentation. So it's got kind of your object, what methods does it have, what properties does it have. So, I mean, these are just available for you to use. So we're not going to talk about those in code tonight. I don't even know that I've ever seen any actual code that uses these. Should you need them, they're there. The next kind of group, and this is a big one, is all of these iterators. We're going to look at a couple really fun examples of things you can do with these, some code samples here in a minute. But basically, these are ways that you can essentially take an array, usually, you give it an array iterator. For example, you give it an array and it can for each it. That's kind of ridiculous because you can already for each an array. But you do need that for some other stuff. But so some of these other iterators, basically, if you have an object that is one of these iterators, it means you can for each it. So even though it's not an array, it's an object, the internals of this make it available to loop across. So for example, a directory iterator, you can give it a path on your file system, and it will let you for each all the files in that folder. And there's n number of other different ones of these, and we're going to look at some examples. So a lot of these use interfaces. So some of the interfaces that they have in here basically allow you to make your objects behave differently than they normally would, or add additional functionality to them. And a lot of it is actually centered around making your objects behave like arrays. So if you have your own object and you would like to make it for eachable, there's ways you can do that. There's a but you have things like countable. So if you have an object and it represents a collection, you can call count on it. You basically are giving it, you're implementing in your object an interface. You have to implement a public method called count, and then you get to tell it how to actually count itself. There's an internal array that you may be using, or perhaps you need to for each and add something up, or anything like that. You can write your own code for what count does, and then when you call count on an object in PHP, it calls this function for you. There's also traversable and various different things that inherit from traversable, which means you can for each them if you just need your object to be for eachable. And a handful of others that basically you can kind of tack on additional array-like abilities to your objects. And you don't have to necessarily, you can certainly make something for eachable, and the implementation of that may actually be like go to a database and make a SQL query and come back, and that's what that for each is actually doing, is making a database query every time. That's a possibility, because you get to define the implementation of these however you want. They also throw in some exceptions. These are looking pretty Java-like these days. out of bounds exception, InvalidArugmentException. But the nice thing is that they give you some more specific exceptions that you can throw, especially with the amount of kind of meta programming features that are starting to get bolted onto PHP in 5.4. It's kind of nice, for example, a bad function call exception. Since you can now pass around functions in variables, you can throw an exception if somebody passes into you something that's not actually callable. It's not a function, it's a string or something, right? You have a more precise exception that you can throw now. You could always say new exception and say, hey, this isn't a function dummy. But from a, being able to try and catch different kinds of exceptions, now you have different classes that are just kind of built into the language for that. So probably, in my opinion, the most important one out of all of these is autoloading. Who actually has ever implemented autoloading themselves? Okay. Who's using a framework to do PHP on a regular basis? So you're getting the benefit of autoloading, you just may not know it. So we're going to talk about that, and that's what we're going to start with. Autoloading basically means you can write a function that tells PHP how to map class names to files on disk. And once you do that, you never have to require anything ever again, or include it ever again. Because if you try and say, hey, I need a new my object, and that's not been loaded yet, PHP will call this function that you define that says, hey, when I say my object, I need you to go look for it in this folder and then include it for me. So the nice thing about this is basically it means that you're writing one small snippet of code to manage all of your require statements, and so you don't need to have a spaghetti list of require statements at the top of every one of your files for every class that you may implement or may not implement. So it's also lazy loaded, right? So if there's certain branches of code where you may not need to load an exception class that's special because you don't have to throw that exception. Well, that means you don't have to load it in memory either. So now you're only loading the bare minimum that actually gets used, and it gets loaded as you ask for it, as opposed to have to say like, oh, require all the stuff just in case we might need it. So we're going to start there. We've got some code samples, and I've left them mostly blank where I could so that we could look at them together. I think it's kind of dry to sit there and read you code samples, and then you read them while I'm talking. It just doesn't work. So let's look at autoload. So really the only function you really care about is SPL autoload register. What this does, you have to pass it something that's callable. So that means in PHP, it either means a closure, if you're talking about PHP 5.3, or it means a reference to a method on an object or a function name. It could just be a function name. Usually you don't see that. Usually it's a closure, or someone has defined an object whose sole purpose is autoloading other objects. In this case, we're just going to use a closure. So we're just going to say function last name. So once this code gets executed, everything after this, if you try and do something with a class and that class does not exist yet, it's going to call this and it's going to pass in, PHP is automatically going to pass in the class name that it's trying to find to this function, and then this function can require it dynamically. So the implementation inside here can really be whatever you want. It should be relatively efficient because if you're talking about a big project, it's going to get called a lot. Because you're going to probably throw this at the top of, if you're using mod rewrite or something similar, you're going to throw this in your index.php, and you're never going to require anything else after that if you're doing all object-oriented stuff. And this is, your frameworks are doing this as well. When we get done with this, I'll actually pull up the Bootstrap code for a Zen Framework app, and you can see that's the first thing they do is set this up. So I've got some classes here, and I threw them in a classes folder. Can you all see that over there? So these classes don't really do anything interesting. We don't care what they do. The point is they don't exist right now. And I also threw them in a namespace just to make things a little bit more dicey. So in here, I'm just going to say, So I need to instantiate these classes. When I run this, it's going to throw a fatal error because it's going to say class not found because they haven't been loaded. Because I haven't, it will actually register by auto load, but we haven't implemented it yet, so nothing's going to happen. Expected, right? We haven't done anything to make this work. So we could start off with, you know, the old school way would be like that. Not fantastic. Now it's complaining about bar, so we'll go through this in here. We only have 2 classes here, so this isn't that big of a deal. So we've satisfied it right now the old way, no errors. But these can get long, and the other thing is you notice there's a pattern building up here, right? There's a very simple way to map a class name to this file on disk, right? We can do some string replacing here, and then we're done. We can very easily construct this string from the class name. So the first thing we'll do is I'm just going to say, you know, echo class name, just so we can see what's being passed into us. I'm going to get rid of these to make sure it actually happens. Right, so SPL/foo, that's what's getting sent in, right? So that's the string we have to work with, and we have to turn that into something like classes / big letter F foo.php. You have to convert it into the actual path of this on disk. So we can do something like, you know, file name equals. I always use __dir inside here because that way, no matter where I run this code from, I know I'm always looking for these files relative to where my auto load is, and I'm hoping that doesn't change. I'm going to throw this in my project in one place. Especially if it's command line, where I make sure that, you know, I can run it from any folder, absolute file path, I can cd into the folder and run it. I'm always going to work with the same kind of base path. __dir is basically the directory of this file, not where I'm running from, but where is autoload.php actually located. And that's a constant. I think that's 5.3 and above. Yes. I know file is 5.2 and above, but I believe dir is 5.3.
File.
What's that?
File and base dir.
Yeah, there's other ways to get about that, but if you have 5.3, this is the nicer, more concise way. So we'll take this, and then we're going to concat, you know, directory separator if you want to make it portable to Windows. I don't care about that, but some people do.
It's not really necessary anymore. PHP will handle it.
Yeah. So let's just go with /. So now, you know, let's just echo file name. See where we're coming here. So far we've got user Josh SPL. So now we basically need to decide whether we care about the namespaces or not. If you know you're only going to ever auto load one namespace, and from this particular thing, that's fine. We can just strip the namespace out and not care about it. If you need to do what's called a PSR0 style autoloading, which basically means your namespace is going to be the top folder, and then the class names will fall underneath that. Every front backslash in your class name basically means a directory level on disk. That's kind of the convention that people are following. So you can make this be able to load any namespace, not just for your code, but I could load Zen's namespace or Symphony's namespace, and it would all work the same because there's a gentleman's agreement that this is how you organize your code. These backslashes translate to folders on disk. So then it becomes a very nice hierarchical map to find your file name. you can have more than one of these things going at a time. So if I'm using Symfony as my framework and I want to bring in Zen's Amazon Web Services client, which is actually pretty decent, I may have two different kinds of autoloading going on, because Symfony 2 is PHP 5.3, they've got namespaces. Their thing is designed to basically swap the slashes, and then that's your file path. Zen Framework 1 is underscores, so theirs is basically string replacing underscores with front slashes, and that's your file path. You can register more than one of these, and if one of them fails, it can go to the next one and try that one. So you can have a whole stack of these, and they can kind of play nice with each other. And hopefully you put the one that's most likely to work at the top, so you don't have to keep calling all of them. So I could SPL autoload register 10 of these if I want to, and they can all be for different libraries. Or I can write one really, really flexible one, and it can autoload every library I could ever come across. In our case, for simplicity, we're just going to strip the namespace off because we don't really care about it.
Of those two options, is there a preferred?
It depends on how stable what you're doing is. If you know you're always going to be using these three libraries, you're better off writing one that can auto-load them all. And you can actually give it some hints, so it doesn't have to use your include path to go find the files. You can actually say, hey, when you look for a Symfony class, you need to start here. And when you look for a Zen class, you need to start here. And don't bother looking over here because the Zen ones are never going to be there. So you can make this smarter. If you kind of mix and match a lot of things, and sometimes it's not worth building something really robust because you may pull in this and you may decide I don't want to use this anymore. Because most people are going to ship you an autoloader that works with their code, and if they did a good job, it doesn't step on anybody else's, so it doesn't really matter.
Right.
It just depends on how many things you're using, how many different code bases you're using to pull together, and there is a performance hit here because eventually it has to go see if this thing exists on disk. Right. You don't want to do that too many times, but that's probably the least of your concerns in the big picture.
Okay.
So let's say we've got file name, looks like this, and then we're going to say maybe something like stir replace. Let's build this up in steps. So we'll say short name equals stir replace. So short name is now basically I've just stripped off SPL / off the front end, right? So this is good. I've got foo, making progress. So now my file name actually can end up being pretty straightforward. I can say, hey, it's always going to be inside this classes folder. And it's basically going to be so I've got my kind of base path, got my classes folder that all my classes live in. I've kind of condensed down what was passed into me to be just the class name. And I'm just adding .php on the end of it. Right, so this is actually where the file lives. This looks good to me. So all we need to do now to make this happy we're good, right? Any questions? So this is very simple, and you can basically there's a couple. If you think about like this PSR0 standard, which basically means it's the way Symfony is organized, it's the way Zen framework's organized, it's the way pretty much everything that's a major PHP component is organized these days, where you have this big hierarchical list, and as you go down the folders, you see those folder names represented in the class name as well, either with underscores in Zen or that kind of the older case, or in 5.3 with namespaces, they're represented as sub namespaces. Every time you go down a folder, you've got another sub namespace on the end of that. So in this case, what I'd really have is an SPL folder, and foo and bar would be inside that. That's how I would map that. It's really like one line of code. to implement. You could smush this all into one line. You've got a pretty solid autoloader for that. The only thing to be aware of is that, like I said, if you really want to do something that's high performance, generally you want to have a way to hint at where it should look for the files at. Because when I require once this file, I have an absolute path here, so that's okay, but you want to stay away from using the include path to make the magic happen, because your include path could have all of your pair libraries and who knows what else loaded on it. You don't want to have PHP going like disk scanning your hard drive looking for these files. You basically want to give it as good of a hint of where to start when you're building these files as possible, so you can always use absolute paths. And you can also in here, if you only want to load SPL namespace things or whatever, you only want to load your namespace, inspect the class name and say, hey, if it doesn't start with my namespace, don't do any of this. Just go on with your life. And get out of the way and let the other people take care of it. Don't do any of this logic at all if it doesn't look like one of my class names.
So you don't have to return false or throw an exception or do anything else for the other autoloader to pick it up?
As long as they're all, you can all register on all of them, no. I believe the spec actually says you probably should. And there's also a concept of fallback autoloaders, where you can get a lot more sophisticated with how you manage that stack. But honestly, for most people, this is good enough. Symfony actually provides, it's called, one of their components is called Universal Class Loader. It's a good play if you want this for your project and you want one that you know works and is very robust. The Symfony one is good. You can get it on GitHub by itself without the rest of Symfony if you want, and it will load pretty much everything. And it's very easy to configure and use. It's a couple lines of code to get started with it.
The Drupal 8 project actually picked that up, and that's how they started integrating Symfony into the core, was just with the class loader as a starting point.
Yeah, it's not much longer than this. It's maybe 3 or 4 times as long as this is, and that pretty much covers all the cases. So this isn't complicated stuff. You don't have to get too fancy with this. Shall I move on? So let's take a look at countable real quick. So countable, really you would use, this is almost always the pattern. When you have some sort of object that you've written yourself, and it ends up with some internal storage mechanism, it's almost always an array. But that array is maybe a complex multi-dimensional array of objects or whatever it may be. And you can't necessarily just count it because you can't count an object, it'll always return 1. If you implement this interface, PHP will do the right thing and it will know that you can go, can call this count function. And then you can do whatever it is that's necessary to actually do the counting yourself and then return the value back to PHP. So this particular thing, I made an object and it just fills up an array with random numbers. So I've got some internal storage here. Here I'm basically just making a new collection. Again, you see this kind of pattern, especially in like database layers, where this might represent a row set that comes back from a SQL query. So I can count this because it implements this count function. I didn't implement it. But in this case, because it's a simple array, all I have to do is do this. Right? And now I can count this object, and what I'm really doing is proxying in and counting the array that object contains. And this seems like, well, why don't you just use an array in the first place? That's a fair point. But this is a very simplistic explanation. Right? This object could actually have some meaningful value. It may do other things that are useful that an array can't do. And you want an object that can encapsulate all that business logic. This basically just lets you use some of these native PHP functions on that object.
And this is good implementation because then your array is private. So somebody can't modify the state of that array. So if you're trying to protect like a configuration file or something, that's a good approach for it.
Yeah, so now I can control access to this, and potentially if I get and set something, I can maybe get something concatenated on the end of it, or I can put special logic on how things get in and out of this array, but I can still use it like it is an array. We're not going to go over how to for each these, but there's something called iterator aggregate, which is in the SPL documentation, which is the easiest way to do it. There's also traversable, which basically is the same thing. What you have to implement is a bunch of functions that look like array functions. Let me see if I can get it to generate them all for us. So now it's underlined this because I've implemented this and I don't have any of the code that backs it up. Iterator aggregate, the concept of it is an interface that basically pulls together a bunch of different other interfaces all in one thing. So it's just kind of like a proxy to a bunch of other ones. But I'm going to hit generate on this, and actually, it's not that one. Go back to that. That is what you want, but I was telling you the wrong thing. The point being, so what you're going to end up implementing is things like next, previous, isSet, unset, rewind, all of those core array functions that you could call on an array that basically can move that internal pointer back and forth. You implement those on your object, and then PHP can make it behave like it's an array. Another one that's in here is array access. Array access lets you access the properties of your object like they were arrays. So I can say something like, C, right? That's the equivalent of saying C foo equals bar. Honestly, I've never really come up with a good use for that. Like, it's clever, but I've never really sat down and said, you know what? I think array access is the right solution here, but it's available to you. For places where maybe you're currently using an array for something and you need to put in some extra logic, hopefully these will allow you to do that and kind of drop it into your existing legacy code and not have to change everything. So places where you were using something simple and now you need something more complex, maybe that's not the right long-term solution. Maybe you do want to refactor that to be more object-friendly, but this will get you started, and then you can go from there. You don't have to change everything at once. For array access, you would be implementing things like get, set, offset exists, all of those other things that let you poke into the middle of an array. You tell your object how to do those, and then it can behave like that to the PHP array functions and the syntax, the bracket syntax, or however you want to do that. And a lot of times, the design pattern here is that all you're really doing is writing these to talk to some internal protected array. You can certainly make it go talk to a database if you wanted to. That seems probably like overkill from a design standpoint. But it's out there. And all this stuff that I have in here, these kind of just little snippets, so I'm going to throw these up on GitHub later, so they'll be available.
So when you implement the counting interface, you call it the PHP count function, so you're actually overloading that function.
Since it's an interface,
right? I mean, normally you do
sort
C arrow
kind of.
count, right? That's how most people call a method, but you called the PHP count, and it knew what to do.
Sort of. So it's an interface. So part of the reason it's an interface, but it has a deep hook into the language where the language knows. So let's start on line 18. When I count something, the language itself knows this better be an array, or it better be an object that implements the counting interface. So that's the language saying, these are the three things I can count. Anything else is basically just going to return one. Because you're counting one thing and you can get one back. So inside here, I'm implementing the interface countable. Basically says I have to implement one function called count. So that's the interface for that. And then I happen to be using the PHP count function on a separate array inside there. That's an implementation detail. It doesn't have to be that. Maybe I have to like for each something and add something up and total some stuff. In this case, I'm just counting my protected array here. So I'm not really overloading it as much as...
On line 18 though, right? Normally if you want to call a method, you do C arrow count, right?
Right, so like...
Right. So in this case it knows.
It's syntactical sugar at this point.
In most languages, an interface is what you would call a gentleman's agreement that I implemented this, right?
Yes, so this is a gentleman's agreement between the language and itself, almost.
Like, is that unique to PHP? Because I've not seen that other places.
It's unique to PHP in that PHP is one of the few C-style, loosely typed languages. There's not many other languages that are at that particular crossroads of paradigms as PHP is. And if we want to talk about something like Ruby, for example, if you wanted this to work in Ruby, you can monkey patch the language itself and make it do that. You can change how objects behave because you have that access. And PHP, you don't have that access. Once you define a class or a function, you're stuck with it. And especially the ones that come with PHP, you're definitely stuck with them. So it's exactly that. It's syntactic sugar that the language basically has a little hook in it when it runs count that checks to see if it's one of these. And if it is, it does call this function. Because it's basically a gentleman's agreement between the core language count function and that interface. For example, the array access is the same way, right? Like I'm using square brackets to access object properties, and that has no right to work, except for PHP has this interface that magically makes it work. It's basically extremely like not just poor, like destitute man's metaprogramming. And you can see like the documentation is good, but it's a totally different style than the other part because it's all object oriented. So it's not as good as those other function documentation in PHP where you're like, it's very, very well, there's lots of examples, it has all the different return values and everything. You know, if we go into array object, this is not the same kind of documentation you're used to. You've got properties and methods, and once you get into these methods, it's similar, but you've got to drill through these object things, and a lot of this isn't exposed like it is with some of the other stuff. And if you go back to the main SPL page, there's a ton of this stuff. And they keep adding to it, right? Every time somebody has that one problem that they've solved, and the core developer at PHP just gets so damn tired of solving that one problem, it ends up in the SPL. It's basically like, it's where they're adding all that like really obscure cool shit that they want in the language, but they can't go change how count works because they can't break backwards compatibility.
It's your garage.
Yeah.
I mean, you got one of everything in there, you just need to find it.
Yeah.
And it's not well organized.
So now that you've said you've implemented the countable interface, if you did see arrow count, would you get a warning saying you should do it? Either way is fine.
Yeah, it's just a public function. There's
that's really cool. I didn't know we could do this.
So array object, and we're not going to talk about that because that's like a whole other thing. Array object isn't an interface; it's an abstract class. Or it's not an abstract actually. You basically it implements all of the interfaces that you might want to pretend to an array. So you basically can like construct this. You can pass it an array, and now you have an object back. Not particularly useful. What you actually want to do is extend this class, and if you need your object to behave like an array, you can extend this class, and basically now you have an object that behaves like an array. It's basically all those interfaces. It's pulled them all in for you. And so this is kind of like the confluence of all these different things all pulled into one. Because otherwise I would have had to do this and I would have had to implement all these methods. Basically with array object, you extend it, and all you have to do is in the constructor somewhere, you have to tell it what array are we using to pretend we're what array are we proxying to, which private one of us is the actual data, and then it does all the other stuff for you. So if you wanted something that truly did all these things, this is kind of like the starting point where it's all encapsulated in there. So let's see what else. Well, let's look at object hash, which I think is interesting. So we have a class that has one public property, And this gets into like PHP's weird equality system. And really it gets into a little bit more than you may want to know about how it's actually working under the covers. So we can have two instances of this object, right? We're not going to do anything to them. They're totally identical. They just happen to be different variables. So when we start out, they double equal each other, right? Let's actually run this. So we can find out that A and B are equal. We can find out that they're actually not triple equals.
Could you make the output bigger?
What SPL object hash does is actually, under the guts of it, it's basically getting into like, is this the same memory address? Is it, not only are these objects equal to each other, like, is it the actual same object? Is this, are these things both pointing at the same instance of this object? So when we start out, even though they're both the same thing, their object hashes won't equal. Because even though they may be the same, they're not actually the same object. It's two different instances. If you see, you know, if you var'd up it, they'll have a different number next to the object. One will be 1 and one will be 2, yeah.
So if B was actually a clone of A, they would also not be equal?
That's a good question. I don't know. We'll find out in just a second. But when we actually set B equal to A, so now B and A under the hood covers are both pointing at the same memory, now SPL object hash is the same, and they are the same object because they haven't changed, and PHP actually underneath is doing the smart thing and doesn't maintain two copies of these things. So B and A are both pointing at the actual same instance of the object. What this doesn't do, and what I learned after I based a whole damn library on this thing, is that it only works while the code's running. So you can't, SPL object hash isn't like MD5. The same object doesn't hash out to the same thing every time. And it doesn't really say that in the documentation. So it only counts while the program is running. After it stops, the hash will be totally different. Even for the same exact objects, like the numbers will be different because it's going to be a different point of memory. And part of what it's basing it on is the memory. So what you can't do is use this to like hash an object and find out if it's the same one we were looking at on the last page view. That's not what it does. But sometimes useful if you actually wanted to know, like, if you have code, for example, that clones versus not cloning. Let's find out if we say, no. Which isn't all that surprising because it's a different memory location. Mm-hmm. So I thought this one was interesting, and I wanted to point it out, if only because when I was surfing through these list of functions, I was like, object hashing, I like that. So I go in there and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. Like, I think of all the cool things I could do with this. And then it turns out to actually not be all that useful. Unless you need to actually be sure you're talking about the same one. And for example, one might be, do I need to know if, is this the real one? Or is this one that we cloned for some other thing and someone pointed this back into my code? Maybe if you're writing a library where other people are going to pass you objects in and out, maybe you do need to know if it's the same one because potentially it points at a resource or a file handle or something and you actually want to know is it the right one. Actually, Zen Framework uses this deep down. There's some places where it clones the view and it needs to find out if it's using the cloned one or the real one to determine whether or not it needs to run a couple functions to clean it up with. So you can, if you need to know, without fail, are these the same object, SPL object hash. All right, well, let's talk about iterators. So perhaps the first go-to one for me is directory iterator. Use this all the time. So directory iterator is basically a nice thing where you pass it a path on disk, and it gives you something back, which is an iterator object. And directory iterator, I believe, we will see in the documentation here, it implements iterator, traversable, seekable. It basically means you can for each it. Any of those things that are iterated, the whole point is to get you back something you can loop over. So you can basically get a big list of all the things in the directory, and then you can loop over them. And this is usually pretty useful because sometimes you want to scan a directory. Maybe one of the things you could do in your autoloader is, I'm not sure entirely why you do this, but you could scan a directory and require all the files in it. Or potentially that is your bootstrap at the top. Maybe you don't need an autoloader, it's not going to work because you haven't organized your stuff well enough. But you don't want to require all those things at once, but you just want to load everything. Directory iterator, you can basically require, it's essentially really easily require star.php is essentially what you can do. You can loop across them and just require them all. So let's look at the output of this. All right, so I ran it in the current folder, and this is all of the things that are in there. What it's giving you back is actually a file info object, which we may play with at the end. So it gives you back an object, not a string. So the nice thing about this file info object, which coincidentally is in the SPL, SPL file info, it has all these things you can do. So it's not just a string. You can get the name, you can get the extension, you can get the owner, you can get the permissions. You can find out my personal most used one, if I'm iterating a directory and I want to do something with the files in there. Yeah, one of the most useful ones is dot. So right at the top of it you have dot and dot dot for the current directory and the parent directory. Those get returned to you in that list. And you probably wouldn't want to require a dot because that would fail. So that basically allows you to find out, hey, is the thing that I'm iterating over actually a file? Or you can go in and they have methods if you saw like is there, so you can find out is it a directory? And if it's a directory, maybe I need to do something else with it. But or maybe if I only want to work with the actual files, I can say, you know, item. So I can say all sorts of different things. I can say, you know, kind of a common pattern when I use this is, you know, get path name is basically the whole thing. Right, so it filters out the two dots that are part of the file system. It did find my .idea folder, which is the IntelliJ PHP Storm project folder that's created in here. What you'll notice it didn't do was go into the classes folder. So it's not recursive, it's just scan it, right? So I could then go and say, hey, is this a directory? If so, list that one, and let's iterate that one. There's a better way to do that, we'll get to that. So at this point, you know, let's go back and look at the file info. So get path, get real path. You can say if it's a link. So a Unix system is it a symbolic link? And if it is a symbolic link, please resolve that link and tell me the full path. You can find out if it's executable, if you can write to it. You know, so you can basically, you know, do a lot of inspection on these files before you need to decide what to do with them. And also, the directory iterator, This one actually doesn't, but there's one of the other ones that will let you say, like, I don't want a file info object, I'd rather have a string. But in most cases, I'm pretty sure you want a file info object because it's way more useful. So that's if you wanted to scan a directory. Now there's lots of other PHP functions that do this. Other ones that come to mind are scanner. If you did want an array of strings back, this would be what you wanted. If you wanted to use wildcards and glob syntax, it's got that. Good news is that there's also a glob iterator in SPL that will let you pass in ant-style globs with wildcards and asterisks, and it will match the file system for those and then let you iterate those. All sorts of iterators. Any questions about that one? And we'll look at the recursive one. Okay. Wow, I didn't even write this one. I must have been really good when I thought of this one. All right, so this one is a little dicey, and it's kind of dumb, honestly. So there's a thing called a recursive directory iterator. So let's go look at that. So if you wanted something that would just go and get you everything all the way down the tree, this is what you want. So you can give this a path. Fine. So we'll say R equals new recursive directory iterator. This is not quite good enough. Because it's recursive, you can't quite for each it. What you actually need to for each this is another iterator. You need a recursive iterator.
Great.
Yeah. So if I want to for each this, what I actually need is to pass it into a new recursive iterator.
All right.
Someone thought this was a good idea. So now I can for each this.
It's a great drinking game.
Every time you say iterator.
Yeah.
So this ends up looking, inside this loop, I can do the same thing I was doing in the other one.
This is called figure out how to use the Unix find command for a few minutes.
Right, so you can see now it's actually gone into this hidden .idea folder. It's gone in and it's gotten my classes folder with foo and bar. And there are some flags you can pass that recursive iterator to tell it what order you'd like to go in. Would you like it to go depth first, I think, or you can have it only give you leaves. But generally, this is going to be what you really, most of your use cases are going to be, just give me everything all the way down, find everything in this folder. So that's not entirely clear in the documentation, but if you were to Google recursive directory iterator, every single page posted on the front page will be about this particular line of code, which is that you need a recursive iterator to iterate that.
Well, what's funny is that if you go back to the output,
Yeah.
for the recursive directory iterator, it doesn't list the directories.
Yeah. But I think that's an option though.
Okay.
There's a flag in there you can pass to it.
I just always get kicked out of that.
So that's that. And honestly, like, I don't use this one very often because usually I just want to deal with the one directory that I'm in. Like, a lot of times it's a folder full of files, but I guess if you have a big thing and you want to scan and process a bunch of images or write some text files, things like that in this big tree, you're going to want something more like
Check
this.
your permissions.
Check by permission?
Check your permissions.
On-
That's when I use it tomorrow. I just thank you.
Yeah. So let's see. Any questions on that? There's a couple other recursive iterators. There's a recursive array iterator. So if you wanted to lock a nested multi-dimensional array, you can use a recursive array iterator to do that. You would do the same sort of thing where you pass in a recursive array iterator into a recursive iterator, and for each that if you wanted to, and it would basically be for eaching all the way down into your array if you needed to touch every item. So that's that. So I wanted to show you guys one other iterator, and then we'll be done. There's no way we can cover all of those things that are there, but you kind of see a taste of what's available. A lot of times I find myself looking at these things and I forget that they're here. Right? I write this crap myself and then realize, oh, it's already there, but it's not like top of mind all the time. The one that is top of mind for me is autoload because it makes your life so much easier. So let's look at this one. So there's another iterator that's called an infinite iterator, which will basically let you iterate things until the end of time. So if you have something that has a finite beginning and end, like an array, you can get an infinite iterator on that array, and it basically means you don't have to rewind back to the beginning. It will just keep going over the array forever, or until you tell it to stop. So right now, if I do this with an array iterator, I'm just going to get something very expected here. Right, it's an array iterator. In this case, there's not really a lot of point to making this an array iterator, except for if we come here, we find infinite iterator. Allows one to infinitely iterate over another iterator. I guess possibly if you wanted to like watch a directory or something, or watch a set of directories, you could infinitely iterate over a recursive iterator over a recursive directory iterator. And basically, till the end of time, get a list of directory things and just keep walking them over and over and over again. As opposed to like kind of like for eaching and then kind of resetting back to the beginning of that thing and going over again. So, if we were to pass this new infinite iterator, I'm not going to run this.
Why not?
If I was to run that, it would basically go until I could go over to my console and hit Control-C enough times to stop the web server. But, so yes, that would print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, until you either ran out of memory or your computer died or PHP crashed. Probably it would be that your browser would die from all the bytes you were sending back to it. That's just for
That would be excellent for image processing, because you do frame-by-frame changes in your image matrix.
Let's just for kicks do this.
That's hard.
Just, you know.
Definitely use that action.
Is it done yet?
No. My fans are starting to come on.
I love how you're willing to fly your work computer.
Oh, maximum execution time.
There you go.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had that.
Fantastic. I didn't even get the output buffer because of that. Anyway, it would have gone on, if I set max execution time to nothing, it would have gone on forever. But if you put this inside of a, a while loop or something, or, you could put in something here that would stop it. For each, and if there's a stop, you can break out of it,
Straight out.
Right. You could do something like that, and preferably you're not echoing, you're actually doing something important. But if you wanted to, it's there. And because the infinite iterator takes an iterator, any of the other things that are iteratable, you can pass into it, and now you can basically, all it really does is shortcut you from here back to here until you tell it to stop. So that's all I have. There's lots of other these. I highly recommend you, at least if you haven't been exposed to this, just read down these. If something interests you, click on it, maybe take a look at it. There's lots of them in here. Limit iterator is kind of the opposite of that. If you have like 10 million items in an array, you could say I want to for each, I want to have a limit on how many can happen. So I'll say, give me the first 1,000, and when I for each over that thing, it'll stop at 1,000, even how many there actually are. It's kind of the opposite of the infinite one. And you can see when you drill into these, they'll tell you what version of PHP they're available above, just like everything else. Because they are, some actually do vary. I think these, like these data structures are going to be the newer ones that come in PHP 5.3. Off the top of my head, I don't know if there's any other new in 5.4. I don't think so. Not aware of anyway. So yeah, any other questions I can answer for you guys? That's the SPL, or at least part of it, yeah.
What's the difference between SPL